Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. Wages $25 a week. Now who would answer an advertisement like that? In 1860, a daring group of young riders did just that. They vowed to carry the mail from Missouri to California at the speed of a racing horse. And in the process, they carved out legends for themselves in the Old West. The Pony Express lasted only 18 months. But in that time, Americans from coast to coast thrilled to the exploits of these fearless young horsemen. For sheer adventure, danger, and heroism, there is no better story than the brief glory days of the Pony Express. It has lived on in history for over 130 years now, and over the years, the Pony Express has become a thing of legend. The incredible human feat of speeding the mail across the vast American frontier on horseback has literally captured the imagination of generations. At the time, it was the greatest enterprise of modern times. But in reality, was the Pony Express a success? It was short-lived. It only lasted for a year and a half. It was a financial disaster that bankrupted the very businessmen who created it. It was such a dangerous enterprise that boys were killed while carrying the mail. And even as the Pony Express was begun, everybody knew its days were numbered. But in spite of the facts, the exploits of these fearless young riders have become a thing of American folklore. Why is the Pony Express such an exciting part of our past? To understand that, we have to go back to the 1850s, when the western half of North America was a great wilderness. Pioneers were beginning to settle Oregon and California, and it took months to get from the east to the west. In January of 1848, along the banks of the American River in California, gold was discovered near John Sutter's sawmill. That find started the great gold rush of 1849. And by the end of the year, more than 100,000 people had stampeded into the West. By 1860, 380,000 flooded into the Golden State. California was growing, but communication back east was slow. There were no telephones, no telegraph, no railroad at the time, and no regular stagecoach service across the great American desert. In 1849, it took up to 6 months for a letter to get to California from the east. Mail was sent first to Panama by steamer, then carried overland where it was loaded onto another steamer bound for California. It was a long, cumbersome process that had to be streamlined. In 1856, the United States Post Office offered $300,000 a year to anyone who could provide twice-a-month overland mail delivery to California. John Butterfield took the Postmaster General up on the proposition. On September 15, 1858, Butterfield sent 2 stagecoaches to California, one from St. Louis, the other from Memphis. They arrived in about 24 days, carrying both passengers and mail. It took 800 employees, 100 Concord coaches, 1,000 horses and mules, and many stations along the way. But John Butterfield proved that a regular stage route could link the East and the West. Although 24 days to California was a vast improvement at the time, Butterfield's route to the West Coast was a long one, 2,700 miles across the great southwestern deserts. There was a more direct way to California, one that cut 1,000 miles and many days off the trip. The well-established Central Route followed the Oregon and California trails west from Missouri. But winter snows and tough terrain could make year-round stagecoach service practically impossible through the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was William Hepburn Russell who first conceived of the idea of the Pony Express. Perhaps a wagon couldn't make it across the mountains in winter, he reasoned, but a lone rider on a swift horse could carry the mail in any weather. Russell was the wealthy part owner of a successful freighting company supplying Army outposts along the Central Route. He knew the territory, had the connections, and reasoned he could win a lucrative contract if he could move the mail all year long. His partners, Alexander Majors and William B. Waddell, were not so sure. Russell was always making big plans and willing to take risks. They were more conservative. But, lured by the prospect of $1 million if they could pull it off, Majors and Waddell reluctantly agreed to go along with the deal.
The Pony Express was, for Russell, Majors, and Waddell, essentially, in the simplest form, an advertising campaign to draw attention to their company, who was seeking that lucrative government route for carrying the mail. And they wanted to do something which would catch the attention, to catch the spirit of the country. And what better way to do this but with young, skinny, wiry fellows on horseback? Because what was involved here was the very essence of what this country was built upon: determination and sheer energy, and it's just a wonderful piece of history.
It would not be easy. It was an expensive gamble, and time was of the essence. The telegraph was moving west, and if they were to succeed, they would have to beat the wires to California.
Now, the need to communicate with California was focused on the fact that California held the gold and silver reserves to finance a war if a war were to take place. And therefore, California itself was being split by this same slavery issue that the rest of the country was. And so the Union sympathizers wanted California to stay with the Union, but the Confederacy wanted California to secede. And so California was being torn apart internally. The thinking was that if communications could be maintained essentially uninterrupted with California during this very difficult period in time, then their hopes were that California would not secede from the Union.
The plan called for relays of swift horsemen extending from Missouri to Sacramento. These young riders would carry only letters, telegrams, and newspapers. They would travel both day and night, as fast as practical, handing off the mail from one rider to the next, all the way across the 1,966-mile route to the gold fields. Averaging 10 miles an hour, the mail would take only 10 days to reach California, less than half the time it took by stagecoach. To accomplish this remarkable feat, Russell figured he would need 80 riders spread across the route, some 400 horses, 25 home stations, and 165 smaller relay stations for the quick changes of mounts. On January 27, 1860, he sent word that his Pony Express would make its first run on April the 3rd. Everything would have to be organized in only 65 days.
Once the decision was made to go with the Pony Express, Alexander Majors was the master tactician. He knew the West. He had the contacts. And so it was his responsibility to set this up.
The success or failure of the enterprise would depend on the skill of his young riders. They would have to be wiry, swift, willing to risk danger, and they had to be honest. The company wasted no time advertising for riders.
The Pony Express ad is an absolute classic. Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows, willing to risk death daily. Orphans, preferred. Think, what does your mind conjure up when you think of that? And you think of young kids with just sheer energy and wonderment, what's on the other side of the hill, and just taking off.
The announcement sent a thrill through every young man along the route. The prospect of becoming an express rider, the promise of good pay, adventure, and glory drew hundreds like a magnet.
The youngest rider was 11 years old, which, you know, you think of an 11-year-old today, and that would put that person in, I think, about 5th grade. But you have to remember that these kids became adults in work and in life very early on. An 11-year-old had grown up on a horse. They knew how to ride. They were expert riders, every one of them.
Pony riders would be hired to cover their own home territory where they knew the terrain and were used to the weather. If they had no fear of Indians, so much the better. Russell set up his headquarters at the Patey House Hotel in St. Joseph, Missouri. Now, St. Joseph was the western end of the railroad, and it had a telegraph connection to New York. It was a logical place to start the Pony Express route. Today, the opulent hotel has been turned into a museum. Director Gary Chilcote.
Here at the Patey House, for a couple of weeks before the Pony Express started, there were between 30 and 40 riders who stayed here, and I think that they were undergoing training. They were also kind of the local dandies with all the girls. It was like today's astronauts. You know, everybody wanted to date a Pony Express rider, and this became the social center here at the hotel. This is where everybody hung out.
As April 3rd approached, the mail destined to make the first Pony Express trip west was being received and sorted in the newly opened express office in the hotel.
Good morning, Mrs. Robertson.
Good morning.
What can I do for you today?
I'd like to send that to my son-in-law in San Francisco, please.
All right.
When a personal letter was brought in, it was first weighed and then hand-franked by the clerk, who then collected the $5 per half ounce that it cost to send a letter to California. The Pony Express also carried newspaper dispatches between the east and the west, and to conserve weight, they were printed on special lightweight paper. Once the mail and newspapers were collected for the journey, they were wrapped tightly in oiled silk cloth for protection from the elements. A tight fit prevented ink from smudging during the trip that lay ahead. Then the packages were placed in the mochila. The mochila was an innovation unique to the Pony Express and an improvement over the standard saddlebag that made it possible to carry the mail so quickly and efficiently over such a long distance. It was made of leather. A weatherproof cantina or box was stitched into each of its 4 corners. The cantinas would actually hold the mail during its journey. Each cantina was fitted with a small padlock, which the express clerk would use to secure all the mail destined for the end of the line. One of the 4 cantinas was always left unlocked for mail that was to be picked up or left along the way. Now, the mochila's design was what made it so unique. It was stitched so that it could be easily slipped over a rider's saddle in a matter of seconds, so that no time would be wasted as riders handed off the mail. As long as the mochila was in place and the rider was on his horse, there was no danger that the letters entrusted to him would be lost. The same mochila was passed from rider to rider along the entire route. As William Russell had insisted, the Pony Express was ready to make its first run on April 3rd, 1860. But the historic start was not to go off without a hitch. It was early afternoon in St. Joseph and not yet noon in San Francisco when excited crowds began to gather for the inaugural ceremonies. It was to be billed as the greatest enterprise of modern times. In San Francisco, the first eastbound rider, James Randall, was sent off with a wild celebration. At 6 p.m., he sped away toward the steamboat Antelope that waited to whisk him and the mail upriver to Sacramento. There he would begin his great overland journey. But at the eastern end of the line, things didn't go so smoothly. By 6 p.m., an hour after the appointed start, people were still milling around outside the Patey house complaining about the unexplained delay. A messenger carrying the first Pony Express letters from Washington, D.C. had missed his train connection in Detroit. So the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad ordered the line cleared, the switches locked, and the locomotive Missouri to run at full throttle all the way to St. Joseph the moment the mail crossed the Mississippi River. When the special messenger arrived, the Missouri headed out and set a speed record that would stand for 50 years. Meanwhile, at the Pony Express stables in St. Joseph, rider Johnny Fry waited nervously for the sound of the Missouri's steam whistle, his sign that it was time to join the celebration just up the street. Today, more than a century after the Pony Express first stormed out of St. Joseph and into the history books, its remarkable story is kept alive by those who gather each year to reenact this incredible adventure. The crowd grew silent as Alexander Majors read Fry the Pony Express oath. That was a pledge that each rider was required to take.
While I am in the employ of A. Majors,
I, Johnny Fry, while I'm in the employ of A. Majors,
I agree not to use profane language,
I agree not to use profane language,
not to get drunk,
not to get drunk,
not to gamble,
not to gamble,
not to treat the animals cruelly,
not to treat the animals cruelly,
and I agree if I violate any of the above conditions,
and I agree if I violate any of the above conditions,
to accept my discharge without any pay for my services.
to accept my discharge without any pay for my services.
Mayor Jeff Thompson then gave a prophetic speech, words that ironically seemed to foreshadow the end of the Pony Express on the very day it was to begin.
St. Joseph. For more than a decade, she has been the portal through which pass the trains for the Great West. Now she is becoming the connecting link between the extremes of the continents. Hardly the cloud of dust which envelops the galloping pony subside before the puff of steam will be seen upon the horizon. Citizens of St. Joseph, I bid you 3 cheers for the Pony Express and 3 cheers for the overland passage of the United States Mail. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray!
Finally, a cannon was fired to advise the ferry boat that Fry was on his way. And by 7:15, the Pony Express was in business. Before long, Fry was carried across the Missouri River and rode off into Kansas Territory, carrying the mail on the first leg of its journey to California. In his mochila were 49 letters, 5 private telegrams, and newspapers destined for San Francisco.
Any time of the year would have been a rough time for the riders. Remember, they were riding 24 hours a day, or at least they claimed they were. Somebody asked me, he said, you know, at 3 o'clock in the morning, if it's pouring down rain, what do you think he was doing? But I would assume that he was out riding his horse and, moving along at a pretty good clip. The mail traveled about 200 miles a day, which is a pretty good distance by horseback.
The first mail from the east arrived in Carson City by 2:30 on the afternoon of April 12th. 9 days later. Despite 4-foot-deep snows in the Sierras, it was only a few hours behind schedule by the time it reached Placerville. There, crowds gathered, guns were fired, and speeches made before a new rider sped on toward Sacramento. The first westbound mochila arrived right on time, just 10 days after leaving St. Joseph. The eastbound Mochilla made equally good time to St. Joseph. It took about 80 riders and 75 horses to make a one-way trip from Missouri to California.
Well, of course, the Pony Express would have worn out an adult in a very short period of time. That's why they chose young, skinny, wiry fellers, people like Buffalo Bill, who was only 14 years old when the Pony Express went out of business. And these people were the kind of folks who could hold up under that kind of pressure.
The newspaper accounts were enthusiastic, the tributes ecstatic. But when the speeches had been made and the cheering died down, it remained to be seen whether the Pony Express would truly become a triumph. During its first month of operation, the Pony Express lost money. Yet Russell, Majors, and Waddell were pleased. Surely, if they could sustain service along the route, they would get the lucrative mail contract. On a typical ride, 12 hours after leaving St. Joseph, the westbound mail would have already been carried deep into Kansas territory. The rider would be nearing the prairie town of Marysville, where he would hand off the Mochilla. The brick Pony Express stables at Marysville still stand today. All across the trail, remnants of the Pony Express still exist. Most are easy to find. Some take a little detective work. Ken Martin is one of the growing number of enthusiasts who not only ride the trail, but also collect mementos from the era. He has converted his garage into a Pony Express museum.
Just riding in a Pony Express myself, to think what them kids went through, and I'm just an acting part of it. You get a lump in your throat. Of all the pieces of history, it's probably one of the most exciting and fascinating piece of history, as for short-lived as it was.
From Marysville, a new rider took the Mochilla on west toward the last Pony Express stop in Kansas, Hollenberg Station. This relay station and stage stop is believed to be the only original Pony Express building still left on its original site. Like Hollenberg, many stations also served as stage stops. And since the Pony Express route followed the Oregon and California trails, they were also known to supply immigrant trains with food, clothing, livestock, and a place to rest as they moved west. During 1860 and 61, express riders would have lived here at the Hollenberg station, which was owned by Garrett Hollenberg and managed by his clerk, George Perkins. It was Perkins' job to look after the riders and livestock for the company. Since the Pony Express ran on a precise schedule, as the relay time approached, a new rider would be given his horse and would wait outside the station, listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. In the beginning, riders carried bugles to signal their approach, but they were soon discarded because they were cumbersome and there was no need for them.
Rider coming in!
Once the rider was in sight, time was of the essence.
He's making good time today, Rick.
Yeah, he is.
The official schedule allowed only 2 minutes for the changing of horses and mail at each station.
Clint, how'd the ride go today?
Oh, not too bad.
Everything pretty clear on the trail?
Oh, better than usual.
Good.
Okay.
Got some letters there, Rick. Couple for Rock Creek, the rest Big Sandy, and all the rest of them go all the way.
Okay.
Have a good ride now.
Once a rider had completed his run, this would be his home until it was time to take the next Mochilla back across the trail. Dwayne Durst is curator of the Hollenberg Station Historic Site.
To me, this was the biggest challenge, setting up these stations, stocking them and with supplies and getting the men hired that would man the stations and all the supplies and food and feed for the horses. There was approximately 100 to 80, 190 stations originally on the Pony Express, spaced about 10 to 15 miles apart. That's about as far as a horse could run at an 8 to 12 mile an hour pace. This was the better part of the trail for the Pony Express riders. They faced virtually no dangers through this area. The Native Americans were friendly here. The big danger was in the western end.
From Hollenberg, the Pony Express drove northwest, following the Oregon Trail into present-day Nebraska. Riders then followed the Platte River to Fort Kearny. Since Fort Kearny was a stop used by Russell, Majors, and Waddell's freight wagons, it's likely that their express riders would have used the fort's sod post office as a home station. Much of the mail carried by the Pony Express was destined for military posts, so the trail touched every outpost along the route to California. Midway between Atchison and Denver, the trail passed Coldwater Ranch, just south of what is now Gothenburg, Nebraska. Here, too, an original Pony Express station still exists. Janice Buddenberg and her family have preserved the station, and like others along the trail, are proud to be a part of Pony Express history.
It just blows my mind to think that they would do this. We're so comfortable now in our cars and all that, the danger of it and the stress of it is just uncomprehendable to me.
Most of the home stations were primitive, with a simple kitchen and rough bunks for the off-duty riders to rest in between runs. Builders used materials they found nearby. Timber was plentiful at both ends of the route. Adobe, rock, or sod worked in the deserts, and caves were dug in the hillside when nothing else was available. Leonard Hilton is president of the Nebraska Pony Express Association.
Well, Midway Station was an important link because it was a home station, and they were badly needed. A home station was approximately, 75 miles apart. So this was really an important part of the Pony Express.
As they sped the mail west across the plains, the riders forded the South Platte River near Julesburg, Colorado, and then rode back into Nebraska territory as they followed the California road toward Lodgepole Creek. When at all possible, Pony Express stations were built near water, at the distance a horse could travel at top speed before the rider would need a new mount, and many were also used as stagecoach stops, and later, many would be converted to telegraph stations. Such was the case here at Mud Springs. The Pony Express station no longer exists. Instead, a modern ranch house stands near the site. But it's real easy to see why the young riders never minded laying over at home stations like this one. The young expressmen along this part of the trail were lucky. The land was flat, the Indians friendly, and from here to Fort Laramie, they rode through some of the most beautiful scenery on the trail. Jailhouse Rock, Courthouse Rock, Chimney Rock, and Scotts Bluff. 3 days out of St. Joseph, and the Pony Express mail was already in Wyoming territory on its way to the military garrison at Fort Laramie. Fort Laramie was an important stop on the Oregon Trail by the time the Pony Express arrived in 1860, so it was only natural that the fort's post office and stables would be used to relay the mail. The mochila didn't stay long at Fort Laramie, however. It was scheduled to be in California in less than 6 days, and both the Rockies and the Sierras were yet to be crossed. From Fort Laramie, the riders followed the North Platte until it joined the Sweetwater River. They then sped past Independence Rock, Devil's Gate, and Split Rock, up the gentle slope of the Rocky Mountains toward the summit at South Pass. Once across the Continental Divide, the trail dropped down through Fort Bridger. From there, it followed the Mormon Trail into Utah and the Great Salt Lake Basin.
Come on, Joe. Pony Express hasn't got all day.
The Pony Express mail from St. Joseph would have been on the trail for more than 5 days by the time it reached Camp Floyd on the edge of Utah's Great Salt Lake Desert. As was true up and down the trail, pony riders here shared their station with the stagecoach. For many years, Fred Abernathy has ridden the trail to help bring attention to the Pony Express and its history. He and his friends come here on a regular basis to practice for their annual pilgrimage along the trail.
Well, we picked a good day for it anyway.
They might not be as wiry as they once were, but it's hard to keep these riders out of the saddle.
Well, we're going to have a mail exchange just like the Mochia exchange like they used to in the old days, where I'm the station master, station keeper. The rider come in, we change horses and riders at this point. Getting ready to go to the next rider for another 10 to 15 miles. We change horses again. We're not very young, but we're wiry. No, actually, that's why they had the young, wiry riders, you know. And we here, the older guys kind of make it a little tough nowadays to get in and out of the saddle all right. We're not as young as we could be, you know. We're kind of fugitive from a rest home, you know. Just bail off there and I'll get the Mochia.
Each year, the legend of the first young Pony Express riders is kept alive all along the trail during re-rides like this one. A modern-day Pony Express still carries mail across the country. The riders still keep on schedule, and they still relay the mochila from Missouri to California.
Well, he'll be headed to west, out towards Rush Valley out here, the next Pony Express station, out here about 10 miles from here. Headed towards Falls, the Lookout Pass, going towards the Nevada border.
For Jack Rhodes, riding the trail through Utah's Great Salt Lake Basin has a special meaning. And his favorite spot is near the old station at Rush Springs.
Well, this monument and some of the others have the name of my great-great-grandfather on there, Major Howard Egan, they called him. He was a major in the Nauvoo Legion, for the Mormon Nauvoo Legion, but he was sent out from Salt Lake by Brigham Young to establish the Overland Trail over into California. And if I can read this on here, I'll tell you exactly what this monument, this is the Rush Valley Pony Express Station, and Howard Egan was the superintendent with offices in Salt Lake City, and I might add further out west out here. So he supervised all of these Pony Express stations from Salt Lake out into the middle of Nevada. And when I found out that this organization existed, I was real happy to join it. And last year was the first year I participated in the reenactment of the ride, and it's quite exciting to me. I've been doing a lot of studying on that ever since. I actually, when I was riding this last year, visualized myself being back in time and looking up on the ledges and watching where the Indians might be placed, watching these young riders carry this mail, and knowing that my great-grandfather at 18 rode, and my great-great-grandfather, which was Major Howard Egan, rode at 45 years old and helped establishing this mail route right through this area. How do I feel? I can't wait each year to do it now.
Chomping at the bit.
Aren't you, bud?
At Simpson Springs, the Bureau of Land Management has reconstructed the original Stone Pony Express station just as it was when originally built in 1851, near a good source of water.
I'll hold the horse. Get the horse. Clear sailing all the way from Rush Valley Station.
How about ahead? Any Indians out there?
I got no report. I hope you have good luck. Watch him on the dugway.
On the dugway.
Go get him, Jack.
Have a good ride, Jack.
I think the thrill that you feel being on a fine horse in country like this with a purpose such as the commemoration of the Pony Express, I think it's the greatest thrill that I can conceive.
This is one of the most beautiful and remote parts of the trail. Life at isolated stations like this was difficult. The work was hard, supplies were scarce, the routine was tedious, and there was always a threat from Indians.
The rider was on a fast, well cared for, well shod horse, and he was able to outrun the Indians in most all cases. The man who really put his life on the line was the station keeper, who was in a lonely spot but like this, pretty much by himself or with a wrangler or a horseshoer, and no way really to escape or to fight or adequate defense against Indians. So he lived a much more dangerous and a much harsher existence, I believe, than the rider.
Just as the Pony Express was starting, the Pyramid Lake War threatened to end it. The troubles began in Nevada Territory when silver was discovered in the Washoe Hills. As hundreds of miners crowded into the remote area, the Pony Express was building stations at the few critical water holes in the desert. To the Native Americans, the white man was encroaching on what limited resources the desert had to offer. The two cultures clashed. Before the Pony Express was a month old, one westbound run was delayed for 6 hours because Indians had driven off the horses at Roberts Creek Station. The conflict escalated when settlers forced the Indians to withdraw to Pyramid Lake. And the Indians ambushed a group of settlers, killing 76 and wounding 29. Soon, remote Pony Express stations became easy targets. Several people were killed at Miller's Station. Then Smith's Creek Station was threatened. At Simpson Park, Indians killed the station master and burned the buildings to the ground. 3 people working at Dry Creek were killed. Some say 2 young riders were murdered there as well. In spite of the urgent situation, the Army never sent help. The Pony Express suspended operations between Salt Lake City and Carson City until 5 extra men could be sent to each station along this section of the trail. It wasn't until June 25th, almost a month after the Indian troubles began, that the first mail from the east finally reached San Francisco again. The trail through Utah and Nevada Territory was the most desolate on the entire route. It would take 2.5 days, moving both day and night, for the mail to cross the vast expanse of desert. After 7 days on the trail, the mochila finally arrived at Fort Churchill on the banks of the Carson River. The fort wasn't even built when the Pony Express was inaugurated in April, but by the fall of 1860, the express station was moved from nearby Bucklands into the fort's headquarters buildings. From Fort Churchill, the Pony Express trail ran to present-day Carson City, and then on to Genoa at the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The Sierra Nevadas would make or break the Pony Express. In good weather, the narrow, rugged trail over the mountains was the most difficult part of the route. When the winter snows came, the passes were usually impassable. Jim Swigert has ridden the trail over the Sierras, and he says the trail can really be treacherous.
The Indians were a problem in Nevada for a short time, but the terrain was the toughest. There was snow and conditions to deal with, of course, all through Utah, Wyoming. There's snow and bad weather and torrential storms, rainstorms, but you had this rugged, severe terrain of the Sierras to get through, and that, I think, was the hardest part. They had to traverse the sides of these hills, crossing streams, getting up over ridges. In good weather, it's a fun ride. In bad weather, it's a treacherous ride. And these guys were young. That's the other thing that you have to admire about them. They were relatively young guys, 16, 17, probably younger than that. And to have someone that age take the responsibility of carrying the mochila and the mail through was phenomenal. I don't know how many 15-year-olds today that you could give that responsibility to. And not to take anything away from the 15-year-olds today, but it's just they took on a job and they did it. And it was a very difficult, very dangerous. Their lives were in peril.
But if the Pony Express was to work, William Russell had gambled that his horses and riders could make it over the Sierras in any kind of weather. The winter snows would be the ultimate test of the Pony Express, and the winter of 1860 was to be a tough one. Heavy snows choked off the passes to California early that year. The stagecoaches that were to run ahead and break a trail for the express riders became snowbound. Soon, the huge drifts proved insurmountable for a lone horseman. There were many delays. The mail was often up to 4 days late. In the winter of 1860, in this ultimate test of the Pony Express, it was obvious the Sierras had won. But even before the winter snows had melted, there were even more serious troubles brewing. The lucrative mail contract William Russell was sure would finance his expensive venture never materialized. The Indian Wars in Nevada had cost the company over $75,000, more than it had cost to set up the entire system. The Pony Express was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. For every letter it carried, it was losing $13. And to make matters worse, the telegraph was moving west at the rate of 20 miles a day. In one last effort to save their floundering company, the partners sent Russell to Washington to plead for help. Instead of bringing help, Russell became embroiled in a scandal that would destroy his once prestigious freighting firm and end the Pony Express. On Christmas Eve, 1860, he was arrested in his hotel room and charged with embezzling $870,000, money intended to help bail out the Pony Express. His bail was set at $500,000 as marshals escorted him off to jail. And soon the giant freighting firm that had dominated Western trails for so many years had passed into history. The Pony Express rode on through the summer of 1861. Ironically, the amount of mail it carried was increasing. But telegraph wires were rapidly advancing across the West. The days of the Express were numbered. On October 26th, the first news dispatch from the East was sent by telegraph all the way to San Francisco. When that happened, the Pony Express was rendered obsolete.
Well, it's a sad ending if you look at that aspect of it. But when you consider the good old American know-how, that's what people really admired about the Pony Express. The problem was how to communicate it with California. The solution was a temporary solution, certainly, but it provided a quick mail service and something that was atypical to the United States. We invented the Pony Mail Service, and we proved that it was successful against all odds.
It was an embarrassment to some extent to Major Russell Waddell. If they only would realize then what they did, they linked the East to the West. They did it, and that's what's so exciting today.
Most people don't realize, but with the fast mail communications, the people in California actually leaned towards the Union and showed their appreciation for this fast mail service.
As we know, in the end, California did not secede, and the Pony Express is credited as contributing to this particular fact.
The express riders' hour of glory was over. But for 18 glorious months, the adventures of these daring young riders had held the nation spellbound. During that time, the Pony Express made 308 runs each way, had traveled 616,000 miles, a distance equal to 24 times around the world, and carried nearly 35,000 pieces of mail. Only one mochila was lost. In the end, William Russell was never prosecuted for embezzlement. He tried and failed at several business ventures after the Pony Express. He died of a stroke on September 10, 1872, at the age of 60. William Waddell never engaged in business after the Pony Express ended. He died in his daughter's farmhouse on April 1, 1872, penniless. He was 65. Alexander Majors moved to Salt Lake City in 1867 and helped build the first transcontinental railroad across Utah. On May 10, 1869, he attended the driving of the Golden Spike ceremonies at Promontory. He would live on to the age of 86, and at the urging of Buffalo Bill Cody would write a book about the exploits of the Pony Express. Many men have claimed to have been Pony Express riders over the years, including the Wild West showman Buffalo Bill. But most of the real young riders ended up leading much less exciting lives. Most lived out their years on the land they once rode across, knowing that they had won a permanent place in American folklore, and indeed carved out legends for themselves in the Old West. In the Pony Express, Russell, Majors, and Waddell had put on the greatest Wild West show on earth. Everyone applauded, but in the end, none paid the price of admission. I'm Red Stegall. Hope you enjoyed this look at an American tradition.